Dead man's hand. A tiny dark craft fell through the void, tumbling and twisting wherever the solar wind carried it. No running lights burned, no thrusters flared. It looked dead, but it was not. It was waiting, watching for ripples in space, the way any angler watches the surface of a pond. Within, two spoke softly, hands bent together. "Do you see?" one said, pointing at a scanner. "Here, and here and again here, near the star cluster." "Yes. It is as the scientist said it would be." He tapped a key on his comm and said, "Prepare the device." Without looking at his comrade, he said, "If we do not succeed, it would be better to plot a course into the heart of the nearest sun and hope that our families remember us with some honor." "That would be faster," the other replied without humor. "Then some of the alternatives." His associate sighed, then said, "Faster, yes, much faster." He tapped on the scanner. "But not as fast as this. Look at it. Clumsy, badly armored, no doubt piloted by a coward and captained by an idiot. But look, faster than light." He shook his head inward in disgust. They could control the quadrant if they wished, but instead they squabble and argue among themselves, every voice raised. A canopy of fools. He looked down at his hand and was surprised to see he had clenched it into a fist. He unclenched it, then touched the scanner again. "But we will see, won't we? Even the fleetest can be tripped if you know where to place the snare." Thrusters sparked for the first time in many days, nudging the craft onto a new heading. Something tumbled out of the ship's hold, something dark, spherical, less than a meter in diameter. The ship moved off and waited. The snare was set. Tobin extended the fan of plasterboard rectangles toward one of the other persons sitting at the table and made the traditional petition. "Pick a card, any card." His dining companion, Scon of Vulcan, lowered his pad the 2 centimeters necessary to look Tobin in the eyes without actually having to move his hand. He was a picture of reserve, of calm acquiescence, calm acquiescence. But there was something in his tone that beckoned a hint of impatience, perhaps even exasperation. "Why?" he asked. Tobin, who was attempting to maintain the cheerfully winning expression recommended by the 99 great card tricks you can learn in your spare time, was momentarily taken aback. The grin slipped, and his features dropped back into what appeared to be, judging by the well-worn spray of worry lines around his eyes and mouth, the expression that fit his face most comfortably. Anxious confusion. "Well," he stammered, then faltered, Adam's apple bobbing, rhythm broken. Tobin patted a pair of stray hairs back over his bald spot and knew he was blushing. "Well, because if you don't, then there won't be a trick." "A trick?" Scon asked. "You intend to trick me?" "No," Tobin said, feeling tiny drops of perspiration. I know the word, I can't say it. Good night, Pi. Thank you so much for hanging out. Perspiration. I know I know the word. I can't say it though. We might have to type that one. Feel the tiny drops of perspiration trickling down from under his armpits. Not trick you, but entertain you. I'm performing a trick. It's an illusion, a sleight of hand. He was familiar with this sensation, though had only recently learned that the Terrans had a name for it. Terrans amazingly had a name for every uncomfortable, miserable, or otherwise unwanted emotional state. They called flop sweat. You're flopping, Tobin, said a tiny, semi-rational voice inside of his head, and you're having an anxiety attack in front of a Vulcan. This is considered to be in bad taste. That's like the Dax in his head. Tobin had been on board the Hennisberg, a ship owned by the Cochrane Institute of Alpha Centauri for just longer than 3 weeks. He shared meals with Scon, who had boarded the ship a week after he had, were the closest thing he had to a personal relationship since leaving Trill. Most of the 20-year-old passengers and crew, like Tobin and Scon, physicists or engineers who had been enlisted by the Institute to work on a project that would, they believed, revolutionize the exploration of the galaxy. Unlike Tobin and Scon, however, all their shipmates were humans, mostly from the Alpha Quadrant, but a few from Earth and Mars as well. Tobin had uncharacteristic confidence where the project was concerned, possibly because his own seminal work in the field was what had caught the Cochrane Institute's attention. But that didn't change the fact that living and working on a ship full of humans, generally considered the loudest of known sentient species, while bouncing around the quadrant to pick up the members of the team on the way back to Alpha Centauri, was more than his overtaxed nerves could take. Tobin liked the quiet, reserved Vulcan mathematician and greatly admired his work in quantum phase variance. So typically, Tobin's way of demonstrating his respect and admiration was to annoy him with card tricks. No doubt, Tobin decided Scon would subtly rearrange his schedule and take the rest of his meals in perfect, blissful solitude. Tobin began to fold up the fan of cards, which had begun to grow sticky from his sweaty fingers. But before he could finish, Scon set his pad on the table, reached out, and took a card. What should I do with it? Put it on the table, Tobin stammered, surprised. Scon did as he was told. The card was an 8 of clubs. Now take another, Tobin said. Scon took another card and set it down the table. It was an ace of clubs. Is there some significance to the symbols? Scon asked. I'm not sure, Tobin said. When Captain Monsees gave me the deck and the book of tricks, she didn't give me any reference material about the history or sociology of the cards themselves. She just said, here's something to keep your hands busy. You fidget too much. Fidget? Scon repeated. Tobin shrugged. Terran languages are full of words like that. It means I'm too, He groped for a word that wasn't too unflattering. Nervous, he settled on. Scon picked up on his pad and softly spoke a few words in his native tongue. Tobin knew that Scon was asking it to search the database for references, and that he would check them later when he had a free moment. He placed the pad on the back of the table and asked, Are we finished? No, Tobin said. Take another card. Scon did. It was the 8 of spades. He placed it on the table next to the other 2 cards. I assume, then, the next card will be the ace of spades. If I do it correctly, Tobin said. Do what correctly? Scon asked. It's called a force. I'm making you choose particular cards. Scon paused and pondered this for a moment, then said, When you tell me that you're trying to make me do something, do you not run the risk that I might attempt to resist whatever you want me to do? Tobin considered this, feeling his spots flush with embarrassment. Well, yes. So I have to account for that in my tactics. Knowing you know that, that's the trick then, isn't it? Scone, who had been reaching for another card, pulled his hand back and stopped to study Tobin's determinedly blank but cheerfully winning expression. Then he reached towards the fan, selected his fourth card, and set it on the table besides the other three. Jack of Hearts. Well, Tobin said, sounding disappointed but not terribly surprised. More practice. Indeed, Scone said, retrieving his pad. Perhaps next time you should not inform your subject that he or she has been forced to pick your particular cards. Yes, Tobin said, slapping his forehead and pulling out the worn hard copy of 99 Tricks. I forgot I should have been running patter to distract you while you picked your cards. Supposed to tell you the story of Wild Bill Hickok and the dead man's hand. Scone's eyebrows raised a fraction of a millimeter. He lowered his pad again, interested despite himself. Explain. It's an Earth legend, Tobin said, flipping to the correct page. The tale of how one of their law enforcement officials was murdered. He was playing a game called poker. I am familiar with the game, Scone said, and was shot in the back by a criminal. After he died, Hickok's companions checked his cards and discovered he was holding 2 black aces and 2 black eights. Since then, it's been called the dead man's hand. Why would his companions check his cards? Scone asked. Tobin shrugged. How should I know? They're humans. Who knows why they do anything? Scone's eyebrows climbed even higher, acknowledging the validity of Tobin's comment, then raised his pad again and resumed reading. Tobin smiled faintly, glad that he had amused Scone, or whatever passed for amusement among Vulcans. Tobin had known other Vulcans and found most of them brisk, and haughty despite their espoused views about diversity. Perhaps Scone was different because, as Tobin had learned, his father had been a diplomat. Tobin suspected that having a diplomat for a father would make one pretty accepting of other people, even humans. From a point just to the left of the center of his being, an amused voice said, even pasty little trills with too much time on their hands. Tobin's hands jerked, and the cards he had been gathering fluttered widely into the air. Leela, he thought, almost saying the name out loud. The doctors at the Symbiont Institute assured him that the voice he sometimes heard was only his imagination, that the persona of Dax's only previous host had been completely integrated into his own, but it still made him jump every time he imagined he heard her. Tobin knew he could be annoying, and he didn't need his subconscious or whatever the voice was reminding him. It was exactly the sort of thing that was starting to make him wonder what the Symbiosis Evaluation Board was thinking when they chose him to host Dax. What did they see that I can't, he wondered as he gathered up the cards and stacked them into the deck. He saw that Scone had already deposited this tray at the recycler and was standing at the door looking back toward him to say, I am returning to the lab. If you would care to accompany me, we can review the adjustments you made to the phase transition coils before we perform another test. He saw that Scone had already deposited his tray at the recycler and was standing at the door looking back towards him. I am returning to the lab. If you would like to accompany, we could review the adjustments you made to the phase transition coils before we perform another test. Tobin smiled gratefully and leaped up. Too quickly, as it turned out. He banged his knee on the lip of the table, and points of the light exploded behind his eyes, even as he hopped around the room trying to get the pain under control while not careening into the other tables or chairs. There came a low, ominous thud, then a shock and a shudder. Tobin. Dax's last coherent thought before everything went dark. Oh, great. Now what have I done? When the darkness began to recede, he was aware of only his aching head, his burning lungs, and something stabbing him in the eyes. It was a sign from the Creator, a sign that he never should have left home, never should have let himself be lured away from Trill by these humans and their insane ideas. It was a sign that said, "Hull breach." Tobin was in a very cramped place. When his vision cleared, he recognized it was the ship's primary Jeffries tube, the one that ran almost the entire length of the ship, from the computer core to the engineering. He was wearing a rebreather, no doubt, because there was smoke everywhere. Scon was there too, his back against the opposite wall, calmingly keying commands into his pad. A thin optical cable ran from the device into a data port in the curved wall. Tobin tried to sit up, but instead bumped his head against the low ceiling. Scon reached out and pressed him back against the wall. "The artificial gravity has failed or been deactivated," he said. "Do not exert yourself unnecessarily until you have become acclimated. Tobin inhaled deeply, letting the rebreather do its job, and he felt his stomach shift a bit on its moorings. He had experienced 0G once or twice in his life and thought he didn't like it. He wasn't cursed with the hopeless disorientation some people suffered. "What happened?" he asked. His voice echoed in his head, reverberated by the plastic cup over his mouth and nose. "I am attempting to determine that now," Scon said, studying his pad. The computer core had been damaged or gone offline, though several of the peripheral servers are still functioning. The damage is considerable. There are hull breaches on several decks, including the bridge. Most of the critical hull surfaces have buckled, and one of the warp nacelles appears to have been shorn off. The Heisenberg is no longer spaceworthy. Did we collide with something? Unlikely, Scron said. Captain Monsi's crew is competent, and the deflectors were functioning properly. The sensors logs show that some sort of space-time rupture just before the ship dropped out of warp. Someone released an explosive near our flight path, possibly a small amount of antimatter, but more likely a nuclear device. That would do it, wouldn't it? Tobin said. But who'd do such a thing? Internal sensors are still functioning, barely, but they detect the type of iconic energy associated with Romulan devices, or Romulan drive units. Romulan, Tobin gasped, almost spitting in his rebreather. But the captain said the route we were taking to the Alpha Centauri is one of the most secure in the sector, and their ships don't even have warp drive. The only way a Romulan ship could get this far away from their own space at sublight would be if they had left their region many years ago, Scon confirmed. But considering even what little we know about the Romulans, such a plan is not so surprising. Tobin slowly nodded his head, working his way through the problem. He knew that the humans and Romulans had been engaged in a vicious border war for the better part of 3 years, ever since one of the Earth's exploratory ships had strayed into Romulan-claimed territory, the galactic equivalent of stepping into a hornet's nest. Very little was known about the fiercely xenophobic Romulans, and the only thing everyone agreed on was that they were ruthless, implacable foes. It was a commonly held opinion amongst the local sentient species that the only thing that had saved Earth from being overrun was its FTL drive and a cunning that Tobin, for one, found hard to reconcile with the offhand, sometimes foolish, good humor. Ironically, as he and Scon had discussed on more than one occasion, the Terran-Romulans conflict could easily be interpreted as one of the reasons for the growing sense of political, scientific, and even military unit found among the Earth's nearest neighborhoods. What could they possibly want for us? Tobin asked. A thought struck him as he felt his heart skip a beat. The prototype. You think they know what we have in the lab? Scon shook his head. Unlikely. The device had not been even researched. The theoretical stage when they presumably left their space. No, if we are correct and have been attacked by Romulans, then I believe they are unaware of the purposes of our voyage. Light from the pads displayed danced across Scon's angular features, cutting deep shadows around his mouth and eyes. The lab has not opened to space, he reported. I think we can assume that the prototype is intact. Well, that's something, Tobin said, relieved. When the Romulans leave, we can dismantle it, take the data core, and use the escape pods. That'll not be possible, Scon reported. All the escape pods are gone. Tobin was stunned. Gone? They left without us? Captain Monsies would never do that. I agree, Scon said. So we must postulate another scenario that fits the facts. If the crew did not escape, then perhaps the Romulans jetsons the pod to make escape possible. But what could possibly be so important that they'd risk? Then he understood. Oh no, he whispered. Yes, Scon said, closing his pad and slipping into his belt. It is the only logical conclusion. He pulled out a small work light and shined a low beam down the length of the Jeffries tube. This leads to engineering. We can confirm our theory there. And then what? Tobin said, pushing himself off the wall, his stomach wobbling slightly. And then, Scon said, floating down the tube into the darkness. We will do whatever logic dictates. Moving through the Jeffries tube in 0G turned out to be less androgynous than Tobin had anticipated. Androgynous? Than Tobin had anticipated, rather like swimming with a mild current. It was one of the few times in his life that he could remember being thankful for his modest stature. The biggest problem, it turned out, was resisting the urge to push off the wall and zip along, but Scon, nearly half a meter tall and 10 centimeters broader, was in the lead and kept their progress at a controlled rate. Closing in on engineering, they found an entrance to the air circulation system, unclipped the grate, and struggled into the considerably narrow space. Fortunately, Scon took the precaution of bracing himself against the duck walls when he stopped, as he would have been shoved through the grill work overlooking the engine room when Tobin bumped up against his feet. Scon pushed himself up towards the top of the duck, so Tobin would creep along beneath him until he could see through the grill work. He saw the Romulans at once. There were two in plain view, clearly humanoid, though their armored EVA suits and reflective visors on their helmets made it impossible to say anything more definite about them. That they hadn't removed their helmets suggested either that they didn't trust the Heisenberg's atmosphere or they had doubts about the ship's continued reliability as a container of said gases. Both soldiers held large energy weapons that Tobin presumed were the Romulans' notorious distributors, named for their tendency to shake apart matter rather than, like the Terran's lasers, bump up its energy state until it's vaporized. The Romulans were herding prisoners towards the maintenance airlock on the starboard side, moving confidently in the 0G. Tobin was relieved to see both Captain Monsies and First Mate Bergen, the computer specialist Mira Lisa, and Katie Coe, the Martian mathematician whose name he couldn't pronounce, Hayes, the navigator, and Chief Engineer Jarman, and two other engineers whose names escaped him. All were apparently injured. It looked like 9 survivors, or half the ship's complement if he didn't include himself and Scon. Tobin pointed and whispered, "Over by the hatch, do you see?" Scon nodded, then spoke softly. "Personal thruster units. They came in through the airlock. That sounded right to Tobin. When the ships dropped out of warp, the Romulans must have had a boarding party ready to cross over. But why were they herding the prisoners towards the hatch? To transfer them to the Romulan ship? No, impossible. There's no way they could do that without EVA suits. The Romulans arranged the passengers in a loose semicircle around the hatch, then stepped back far enough that they could cover the entire group in crossfire. When they were finished, a third armored figure floated out from behind the warp core, paused briefly to study the blue light that danced within the containment fields, then pushed off until he came to a stop in front of the airlock hatch. The Romulan commander and Tobin had no doubt that was who this was, peered through the small round window, then tapped on it with the knuckle of his armored glove. Tobin had almost jumped back when a hand slapped the window from the other side. It was replaced almost immediately by a face, a round, soft face, one of the project technicians, a woman named Williams. Tobin had been introduced to her when he had boarded, but they hadn't exchanged a word since she worked the gamma shift, and he tended to work during alpha hours. Her unprotected face was smashed flat up against the thick viewpoint as she screamed soundlessly at the Romulans. Tobin was surprised to see that she seemed more angry than frightened. In fact, though he has by no means proficient at lip reading, Tobin was almost certain that Williams was cursing at the Romulans. The Romulan leader moved his face closer to the window, apparently so he could study her expressions more carefully. It was disconcerting to Tobin to watch the woman go on and on. Her breath fogged the glass. Everyone, including Williams, knew that what was about to happen. But the tension of waiting for it to occur was almost more than Tobin could take. Finally, Williams' cursing subsided, and she only stared at the Romulans, her breath coming short and fast. Then, almost offhandedly, the commander flicked a finger towards one of the guards, who then jabbed a switch on the airlock controllers. 3 telltales over the hatch turned red, one after the other, and the face in the window disappeared. Tobin thought he heard a sound of air being expelled, though he knew that was impossible. Then he heard it again and realized that the noise was coming from Scon. Though, whether it was a moan, a sigh, or a prayer, Tobin never knew for certain. All the scientists and crewmen seemed to sag into themselves. The telltales cycled through again, and the lights shifted back to green. The commander turned back to his prisoners, then walked the perimeter of the room and pointed to different pieces of mechanically controlled panels, diagnostic devices, until he finally returned to where the researchers' team and crew now stood huddled together, some staring at the floor, others glowing at their captors. The commander prodded first one, then another team member towards various pieces of equipment, but each and every one solely refused to move. "The message is clear," Scon said. "Cooperate or die." "But it doesn't look like any of them are going to do what he asked," Tobin said. I'm not sure what that is. Incredibly stupid? Foolishly brave? "I have observed," Scon replied, in a manner that would have sounded admiring if he were anything but a Vulcan, "that humans are very stubborn people." The Romulan commander had clearly come to the same conclusion and decided that another demonstration of the consequences of noncompliance would have little impact if the prisoners did not have an opportunity to ponder the first one. He ordered the guards to move the humans down a short hall that Tobin knew led to a cargo hold. Even as the prisoners were herded off, a 4th Romulan emerged from the depths of the engine room and began to study control surfaces while the leader turned his actions to the reaction chamber. Tobin and Scon eased back into a recessed area that was far enough away from the grill that he could speak near normal tones without the risk of being overheard. "You were right," Tobin said. "They're after the warp technology." Tobin said. That, Scon replied, would be a logical conclusion. It is suspected that the Romulans are years, perhaps decades away from developing warp drive. However, if they had a model to study in detail, yes, it would take them long to figure, it won't take them long to figure out. Fine, Tobin said, his voice rising sharply with impatience. So what are our options? They are almost as limited as our resources, Gon said. I would order our priorities thus. First, prevent the Romulans from taking possession of the Heisenberg. Second, if possible, free our comrades and escape. And third, Tobin said, save the prototype. Think of the combined years of work and research that have been sunk into it. We have to figure out some way to salvage the database, if nothing else. I don't think any of the labs that have contributed work have copies of all the files, and there's work we've done on board that no one else has. I have not overlooked this, Scon replied, but I think we must consider it is a distant third object. Preserving knowledge is a high priority, but logic dictates that a higher one is preserving the lives of the device's creators and preventing that knowledge from falling into the hands of those who might use it for evil purposes. Tobin stared. Scon, he stared. Sorry, it's just that I don't think I've ever heard a Vulcan use the word evil. Do not misunderstand me, Tobin Dax, Scon said. Evil, malicious, malevolence, call it what you will. It's not abstract concept ascribed to some supernatural power. The desire to gain advantage over others, either through deliberate action or inaction, is one of the fundamental motivations in sentient beings. How could logic overlook such a primal behavior? I see your point, but it still doesn't address the question of what we're going to do. Let us rule out one thing, what we cannot do. Scon said. We cannot overpower the Romulans with force. I've counted 4 armed soldiers, 4 thrusters packs. I believe we safely surmise there are no others. But the odds are still 2 to 1 against us, and we have no weapons. The element of surprise might aid us slightly, but not sufficiently. The Heisenberg, as we discussed previously, can no longer achieve warp speeds without substantial repair work. The Romulans' vessel would ensure us to escape, but we have no way to commandeer it, and our escape pods are no longer an option. I don't think I like where this is going, Tobin said. Scon did not respond immediately, and Tobin would have sworn that he could hear the sorted and resorted variables trembling around in Scon's mind. Finally he said, our options have dwindled down to 1, Tobin. We must destroy the Heisenberg. What? Tobin hissed. That's the best logic can come up with? Scon held out his hand in a soothing gesture. Be calm, Tobin, he said. Considering how carefully the Romulans planned this attack, it is remarkable that even the recourse is available to us. But to destroy the ship, the prototype, everyone aboard. The Romulans are not known for taking captives, Scon said. They will likely execute our shipmates anyways, whether they cooperate or not. The same is true for us. The ship is too small for us to avoid detection indefinitely. But still, Tobin said, his mind racing. Tobin Dax would be the first to admit that he was not the cleverest trill to ever grace the face of his planet, not the sharpest blade in the knife block, as his mother, a wonderful cook, used to say. His success as an engineer were, he believed, more attributed to plodding perseverance rather than brilliance or insight. His only notable talent, if it could be called such a thing, was his ability to panic, or more accurately, to think his way through panic. Rather than making his mind lock up, panic sent Tobin into a cognitive overdrive. Perhaps it was this ability that made the Symbiosis Commission decide he would be a worthwhile host. let's stop it there because I think that's a really good pause. Oh my gosh. I totally forgot about this chapter. Oh my, I just woke Q up. Oh shit, I forgot that this was Romulans trying to get the first warp drive. Holy shit.